You're listening to Forge Theater Labs,
a podcast devoted to exploring theater history.
Where does that idea come from?
concepts in storytelling.
Is anything that original?
Isn't that just an assumption?
And the creation of theater from behind the scenes.
How do they even do that?
This is Forge Theater Labs.
History, innovation, perspective.
Welcome to Forge Theater Labs. This is Josh N Hsu. I'm so excited today to welcome Afrikah Selah to our podcast. Afrikah Selah, they, them, is a cultural critic, writer, and thinker whose work interrogates art, identity, power, and criticism beyond binary frameworks. Afrikah's essays and cultural commentary challenge Western hierarchies of value, advocate for more expansive critical voices, particularly BIPOC and non-conforming writers, and ask us to slow down, look deeper, and sit with complexity in how we make and evaluate art. You can learn more about their work at itsafrikah.com. Welcome, Afrikah.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I am so excited to sort of jump in today and sort of explore this idea of art, criticism, and cultural responsibility with you. And specifically, how we can sort of break this binary thinking that pervades that thought. And so I thought I'd start off with an icebreaker. What's a label people often use for you that feels incomplete?
Ooh, I'm a multi-hyphenate, so sometimes using just one label feels so hard because my journey as an artist, a critic, and thinker also comes from the fact that I used to be a stage manager. I'm a producer. I know processes and I enjoy them maybe a little bit too much. But I think it's the thing that feels both incomplete and complete at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's actually what inspired me to sort of create our unique brand of Forge too, was I started out as a musician who then found theater and loved theater. And then, whenever I need a break from theater, I go run off and do music and I do other things and I compose and I write and, I teach test prep for fun. I don't know. It's a very strange world. So I understand that sort of, especially with theater, there is this sort of desire to sort of live in one space. You often actually write about binary thinking, artic versus critic, good versus bad. Where do you see these binaries doing the most harm in how we engage art?
I always think about this question, especially we're in a time where we're reckoning with a literacy crisis. So binary thinking is often the default, right? And there's this little stream that within that, it goes against the fact that so many things can coexist at the same time, right? So just as we're saying, we're multi-hyphenates or how we got started in one thing and we moved on to another. And so with binary thinking and how we engage with art, I think it harms us being able to see layers, whether that is the time that we're experiencing something or who is experiencing it and why or how. I think it really limits us by giving more of finite statements than letting us lead with curiosity or wonder or reflection or just some sort of visceral reaction that lets us go deeper.
Absolutely. I think, one of the things about sort of being an actor, being a performer, is that there's a certain level of cognitive dissonance that we must hold, right? And we have to remind ourselves that our audience, we need to also let them sort of invade that sort of cognitive dissonance, that holding two conflicting ideas is not a bad thing, right? Holding two sort of contrary ideas. And I think especially culturally now where it's easy to vilify, people in a very direct way or vilify, a certain brand of thinking in a particular way is easy. For you, what gets lost when criticism functions as a verdict instead of an inquiry?
I feel the short answer is we lose that possibility, right? After everything ends, to explore, to challenge, to create, or respond. And so going back to vilifying something, is there something in there that we can actually transform, right? So we can move away from, things that could be harmful or maybe moves us away from the progress we're making and instead can that come into maybe a framework of how do we address accountability or harm in a moment or etc. So I think that's what's get lost.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you think of, without sort of calling anybody out, can you think of a show where perhaps you saw it and it was very clear that they were sort of laying down a verdict instead of an inquiry? Because, philosophically, as a director, I am always interested in sort of asking questions of my audience. And that can be in a confrontational manner without sort of providing a verdict, right? And,
Mhm.
my hope is that our audience arrives at their own verdict with the recognition that I'm not there to sort of tell them what's up. Though I have had audiences go, I'm offended by what you just said there. And I was like, I didn't say anything. I was just presenting a question. Um, can you think of something where the consequence of the verdict was actually diminish the show, or any sort of specific examples?
There's one that I think we'd name largely, but I think because time has passed and there's been so many conversations out of it, I don't mind naming it. I think a lot about the the K-pop musical that was in New York, and there was a verdict that was a criticism, which was more harmful than helpful. I think a lot about that specifically around like what happens when criticism doesn't have the cultural context that it needs, whether that is from the critic or from some other means that was not like translated well. I think a lot about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think about that show a lot because I think, the criticism of that show was definitely sort of in the sort of mind of a verdict. But I think also as a show, I think there were some valid criticisms of whether or not that could execute. And like that was a show that really had, from a creative standpoint, thinking about the sort of binary, definitely had a verdict in mind. It wasn't an inquiry of K-pop. It was very much like you know, this is what K-pop is. This is what I want you to feel. This is what I want you to think. And, unfortunately, the criticism also came from that place of verdict and not from inquiry. And it sort of, right, created that sort of perfect storm.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I would say when we think about particularly, our roles as makers or commentators, there's often sort of this false divide that we are brought into, that we're sort of drawn to, right? That we either have to be a maker or a commentator. How has that shaped your work? How is that false divide? Because I feel like as a director, as a dramaturg, you do have to sort of live in both worlds. And so how has that shaped your work?
I feel like in most circumstances, which I think has been interesting now that I'm also a critic, I've been someone people trust to come hear my thoughts in a certain work because of being both a maker and now a commentator, right? But I also feel like with my peers who are like playwrights or directors and also a critic, there is that tension of like, well, how are we still part of the community as artists? Because again, like there feels like to some degree critics are often siloed from their communities because they have to be the one to give, critical thought, to give critical ideas around something where they're stuck kind of as the witness instead of the participant as well. But I think it also brings up another question of how can we show up as both in a way that doesn't harm or hinder our ability to show up as collaborators, neighbors, or just really our whole selves.
Yeah, I think, this is a typical thing that we all experience as artists of like we finish a show and we go to our friends and we're like, "What did you think? Give me your feedback." And there is that tension of having to answer of be like, "I'm your friend. I love you. I support everything you do. But also, how do I honestly give you feedback in that space?" And I think, like like I'm always scared that I'm going to accidentally offend someone with an offhand comment, right? Because it's meant out of love, it's meant out of care. And I'll give a specific example. Years ago, I was asked to sort of give my feedback on a script that a friend had provided for me. They were ready to sort of shoot it and film it and wanted me to come on board and perhaps be the director. on that. And I thought it was going to be a sort of earnest and honest conversation about how we thought about the script, and, that I might have some ability to provide feedback about how to craft it and structure it so that it would strengthen the story. That did not go over well when I provided that, right? Because they were basically looking me to slot in and praise them, which, valid. And they were early in their career, so they were sensitive about it. And, I lost that job as a result, even though I did feel like it was still a solid script. It was still a project that I wanted to be involved with. I just wanted to be the best that it can be. How do you find yourself reacting in those moments where someone says, well, what did you think of my show? Like, is it in that moment that you need to answer, or is that in that moment you'll be like, let's set a meeting, let's sort of go through it, let's break it down, like, let's, or do you say, oh, I'm just here to enjoy the show? Like, what do you do, especially, if it's someone you care about? No.
hmm Yeah, like it's one of those things where I love my friends so much. When they come to me, I'm like, wow, I'm so honored that you trust me. It's like, for example, I'm a big believer of, like, when you see a show, don't talk about it for 10 blocks. Because you know what happens out of the very things from social media. But, like, for that, it very much is like, "Hey, let me set aside a meeting," or, "Hey, is it okay if I, like, type up some notes and then send it to you and we can have, like, a conversation or something? Because it feels, I'm feeling the tension right now just thinking about it, of, like, being put on the spot of, like, "Well, what did you think?" And I'm like, I really just want to enjoy this moment before, like, it all goes south. Yeah, like, I feel like regardless, there's, like, a level of care. Like, I have a friend where we both like different genres, but, like, when we're together, we love a good bit. So when I go see a show, I'm like, I'm no place to criticize, because that was out of joy, and I'm not gonna disrupt that.
Absolutely. I think it's also, we often talk about like how to respond to people who ask for feedback, but also there's a way of asking
Mhm.
that I think we have to remember in that moment. Like I'm guilty of this, of like immediately, like we just had our live taping of our first podcast, and there is a local director that I highly respect, that I highly well, and I immediately was like, what did you think? What did you think? Like, I need to know every single detail. And he's like, well, why don't we get together later? And I was like, yes, absolutely. But what did you think? Really? No, like, tell me your thoughts. Um, and so I think there is that sort of urgency that we sort of bring to feedback. And
Mhm.
I think, yeah, I think, in your opinion, like, what does urgency prevent us from noticing or feeling or understanding about the art?
Yeah, I feel like I'm in this space too of, like, reckoning with that in different ways, but I think with urgency, instead of letting us, like, really be present with ourselves and, like, what's coming up, and, like, mirroring or processing whether we're being challenged by something or just fully presented by, like, the urgency feels like you have to have immediate thought or hot take, or, you have to have, again, that binary thinking of, is it a yes or a no? Meanwhile, like, what if over dinner you have a new perspective on something and you're like, oh, this actually went deeper than I thought? Like, I think it really removes us from just being able to do this, and not feel like it has to be like a social media post or a video essay, or something that is suddenly shared with everyone.
Yeah, I think there's that sort of culture of like swipe left, swipe right,
Mhm.
right? And like, is this relevant to me now? And I think that's something that I often think about when I think about the why now test. The more I think about it, is that it is, like in today's culture, it's very much like when I watch a TikTok video, is this relevant to me? When I watch an Instagram reel, like, is it relevant to me? If not, swipe right or left, without giving it the space to sort of think about that, right? And I think, the way we consume our media now is on such a fast pace that I think maybe the why now test can be limiting, I have asked many guests on this show, like, what is your why now test? How do you utilize it? But I guess this is a big thing, is like, like, how do we reframe the why now? Because it can be so limiting, especially when we're sort of driven by convenience, trends, speed.
Yeah. Like, I was always trained that with the why now, it sort of gives you like what is essentially your elevator pitch, right? But I feel like that question, and this is really an agreement that both the question and the answer can feel like a vacuum or that echo chamber tied to urgency. And it's like you're really competing for that visibility than just simply being. And so for me, I like to kind of reframe the question as like, what is it in conversation with? Because I think if your art is not in conversation with something, and it doesn't have to be deep, right? I think that's when it gets lost. So like, is it in conversation with like, it could be a meme or politics, social change, whatever themes really, an artist feels called by? Or is it about community, whether that's like by identity or it's by, your neighborhood or where you're from, or like just culturally, like what are you in exchange with? I think it's like the best way to also reframe that question too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, especially young artists as they're getting started, they feel like this need to write something that's relevant. And you often hear like write from the heart, write what interests you. And maybe that is like that is what's happening right now. But like who you're talking to with your art matters as much as what you're writing about. And that's what I'm getting. Why don't we take a short break? This is Josh from Forge Theater Labs, and we'll be right back.
At Forge Theater Labs, we're building bold, imaginative theater, supporting new artists, new stories, and new ways of experiencing performance. We're proud to share that Forge Theater Labs is now a sponsored project of Fractured Atlas, which means your donations are tax deductible and directly support the creation of this podcast, live tapings, and artist-driven projects. If our work has inspired you, made you think, or brought you closer to the theater community, we invite you to help keep it going. You can make a donation by visiting forgetheaterlabs.com for our link to our Fractured Atlas page. Every contribution, big or small, helps us forge new pathways for artists and audiences alike. Thank you for being part of our community.
Welcome back. This is Forge Theater Labs. Just now, we were just talking about this idea of how we talk about art, who gets to talk about talking, who gets to do the talking, excuse me, what frameworks we inherit and what it means to critique responsibly in this moment. I thought we might sort of turn it to sort of who gets to write, and how our identity shapes criticism. And so here, let's sort of talk about this idea of what do we mean when we talk about culturally minded criticism? If you could define that for us, like what is that to you?
Ooh, um, oh my gosh. So I want to start off with culture is always a living thing. And so I really think about culture as that, and also like in our lives, right? Like culture is a time capsule, right? I will admittedly say I'm a Gen Zer. So it's like there's a lot in there where I'm like, I remember like VHS tapes, but then also I remember when like Snapchat and TikTok were just coming out. But with that, I think with culturally minded criticism, um, it is diving deeper into, as we look at art, like what are we in conversation with? Whether that is through aesthetics, through to me, I like to do current events and also historical analysis to some degree, that I think deepens or at least gives depth to a piece of art that is not just like a can't miss experience.
hmm What do you feel like that culturally minded criticism offers that our sort of typical dominant frameworks consistently miss?
Yeah, I I think culturally minded criticism really opens us as artist, critic, and audience to think and engage with art that feels more on a personal level. So instead of it just being, hey, again, like can't miss experience, come witness it, it allows us to digest and slow down and either be in conversation or just be a little bit more introspective in a way that is more, this is going to sound very opposite to each other, like intimate, but then also like broader in context, or at least that's my hope. Where, we have so much great art that exists, whether on a local or regional or national level, that when people see it, like, yes, it should be like the can't miss thing because, of course, theater and most art is ephemeral, but also,
Mhm.
um, what is it that like draws you to it? That's not just the flashiness of it all. I think often with dominant frameworks, it is very much this is what I didn't like, this is what I liked, and like maybe this is my final verdict of whether or not you should see it. But I feel like it can be so much more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I often think about sort of when we sort of consider dominant frameworks, there's this line that sort of commonly sort of pops up where it's like, that was fun, but it's not for me. Or at
Right.
least that's what I'm reading within the text. And what I want to see is like someone who what it was for, what did they get out of it? Was that a different experience? And I think that's something that's often missing. I have experienced these critiques myself where it was like, well, I don't understand it because it's not talking to me. And so therefore it's not a good show as a result. And I think that's a very difficult conversation to have. But to be able to sort of invite critics, whether they be gender nonconforming or BIPOC critics into the conversation, I think can sort of open up, that conversation. Um, like for you, why do you think it's important that we sort of encourage these BIPOC and gender nonconforming critics as shapers of critical language?
Sure. So I will have to admit, I'm also a bit of a YouTube girly. So I will have to shout out, I think, bell hooks, because I think bell hooks really shapes this like answer really well. But on cultural criticism, cultural criticism and transformation, she talks about how the aim of cultural analysis is really about the production of, enlightened witnesses. Wow, sorry, y'all, words.
That's okay.
But really asking us as audiences to, I think, be more engaged with how life is being presented, both with informed, but also more vigilantly. And so in that, it's really about creating language and a perspective that shifts the inherent belief that we as queer, gay, lesbian, and also BIPOC and gender non-conforming people to have agency and a future, right? So really, I think if we had more diverse critics, we're being entrusted to shape the critical language, which shapes then the perspectives that bridge and create space for us to continue to create the futures that we desire or want to see.
That's really exciting. Can you highlight some publications or perhaps platforms that have supported your work that are sort of at the forefront of this?
Yeah. So as a critic, my journey has been from like a local to like larger level. So for me, I would love to shout out like where I got started and go from there. So the New England Theater Geek, it's ran by a queer editor and team who's just been very fantastic. The BIPOC Critics Lab, created by Jose Solis, who's really at the forefront of creating more access for critics of color to thrive no matter where they are. Three views, where I really appreciate in their approach, like criticism can look like anything, as well as their support of new voices, new writers in the works, as well as American Theater Mag, HowlRound, who
Mhm.
really, shout out to them for like creating these spaces to even just experiment and really push forward, as well as the National Critics Institute, who really has helped and challenged me about what does my criticism look like and how can I connect to readers and audiences.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing all of that. You know, given all these platforms, given all these sort of, available places, um, have you ever experienced any sort of obstacles? Like identity is complex and typically when we talk about, conversations about representation, I have found, even as an artist, that people say that I should be making things based on my identity. Does that same pressure exist within criticism? Because like only X can talk about Y. Like that's so hard.
Yes, and as someone that has certain identities that aren't visible, like I think there's also a piece in that of like as a writer, how do I avoid speaking for everyone? But then also like how do we use discernment wisely? I think that's like the umbrella of it all. But I think there's also 2 points where whether you're a critic, a reader, whoever, like, are you in relationship with X or Y, whatever that is based on, race, gender, sexuality, etc. And if yes, like, what is your relationship? Because I think proximity like really defines that. Although there's an asterisk on proximity around like ally and advocate and all of that, but it's I think being able, um, in this tension, really, I think navigating and acknowledging what is absent, what is present, giving recognition to whatever work is being done and inviting people to learn more. So, like, I know in my work, I'll be like, I can't speak to this. However, like, this is what I am aware of and like what I have seen. And so this will be a moment where like I will address it, and bring up a historical moment. And like that too is on me of being like, I have to do my research because I think as a critic, I do have to be accountable to who this is for, even if it was or was not for me. As well as I think too, like, if a work really speaks loudly on that, like making sure that the piece also represents that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the same is true for, directors, playwrights who decide to sort of engage with a subject that perhaps is, perhaps they're passionate about, it excites them for some reason, but it perhaps is not within their sort of immediate proximity. It isn't that you can't write about it, it's that you have to be able to, engage with a community where it is proximity so that that community is represented within the text itself. You know, um and I think my biggest concern with sort of, culturally minded criticism is making sure that we don't reduce critics to identity proxies. And that is always been at the forefront of my mind. Or, even with artists, uh, I can only direct these shows because that's what I am, right? And I have found that tension within myself. Like, I love German expressionism. I love Brechtian theater. That is like a something that has spoken to me since early on. But yet, can I speak too much about Beijing opera? No, absolutely not. Even though I grew up with it, like, I am not the expert in that space, and so I feel culturally distant from it. And so I often find that tension living within me. Um, can you cite any examples of like perhaps a project or a moment where you did have that tension and how you navigated that?
Yeah. Maybe not as a critic, but like as a dramaturg, like I will admit I don't do musicals. I love musicals. I just think for me, dramaturgically, I'm not meant for musicals. And so I remember I was tasked with one, and um I think I was really challenged because I was like, I have to learn the structures. Like I know, like I think looking at one what the structures were, but like I think being challenged by some of the things, especially like the work that I often go after, I was like, okay, um, ideally, I think whether you are a critic or an artist, like you're working with a team that can help fill in the gaps and you kind of learn alongside them. But often, like I think it's like a mixed bag of what you can do. But I think with that, like bringing back to criticism, this is why we want more diverse critics, right? We want identities and different backgrounds to avoid reducing critics to certain identity proxies. But then also, right, like I love as critics when you're able to bring a friend and you get their thoughts, and then that also informing a new perspective that you haven't thought about. Where like I have like some examples I didn't want to share without these people's consents. But it's very much like one of those things where that's what makes criticism a little bit more enjoyable, and it also brings in that dialogue a little further.
Absolutely. I particularly love it when I bring someone who's perhaps not the most informed about theatrical experiences and sort of bring them into that space and get their earnest opinion. I brought some friends who aren't, really interested in theater. Like that is not their thing, but they have found their calling with shows that are just absurd. And I know that that's what they enjoy. They love these sort of like, in your face shows. And for the most part, they have enjoyed all the shows that I've brought them to. They've had really positive feedback. I've learned a lot from them about sort of like what appeals to them, and that's shaped my craft. But there was one show where they didn't enjoy it at all. And I won't call it out, but they didn't enjoy it. They really hated the experience. And they were like, Josh, what did you bring us to? And they like didn't know how to broach the subject and didn't know how to be like, that sucked. Like I hated every moment of that. Like, was that just me? Like, did I see something good? And like opening that space for them, I had to like sort of be like, hey, let's talk about that show that you just saw and what it is about that experience that you didn't enjoy. And there was this moment of relief. It just melted off their faces. They were like, oh, I thought you thought it was so good. And we were like so confused. And so they felt this pressure to hide their actual feelings. And I was like, I don't want that ever for you to, we're going to see bad shows from time to time. And that is going to happen. And it's okay to not enjoy a show, right? Sometimes it's not for you, but in this case it was for them, but it wasn't. They were like, they actually had issues with the execution, but didn't know how to articulate it. When you're sort of, right, if you were to mentor a younger critic coming into this space, what is some advice that perhaps you might give to like invite the conversation, to open it up, to let the floodgates loose, so to speak?
Yeah. I always like people have always asked how I've handled like criticism. But for me, I'm like always write either A, like it's your journal entry, or you're writing to your best friend, even if that is you, like if it's not writing, like voice recording it. Because I often find like that is when you don't have the filters, right? You can have the floodgates open and really talk about like the thing that like really riled you up, or like the moment an audience, was with you along like a reveal or like a point of transformation. And I think like that is the beauty of criticism of like it doesn't have to be academic, right? It doesn't have to be, well, maybe think of like 17th centric like XYZ. And let the editing process like figure out the rest later, right? Like let it then be, okay, maybe we have to restructure, this underlying thing about why you don't like birds. Again, who knows? It could be Ibsen. But it could be that, or another thing that like comes to mind is like, what is the form that your criticism exists? So if it's not writing or voice memo, like is it art? And like how does that help you process like how you're seeing things and like forming your opinion?
That's such wonderful advice. We've been talking to Afrikah Selah. We're going to take a short break here. We'll be right back. I'm Josh Hsu. This is Forge Theater Labs. Want to get your brand in front of a passionate, creative, and engaged audience? Forge Theater Labs is looking for partners to sponsor this podcast and join us in bringing bold, innovative theater to life. If you'd like to place an ad right here, reach out to us at marketing@forgetheaterlabs.com. It's a simple, powerful way to support the arts while sharing your message with listeners who care about creativity and community. Again, that's marketing@forgetheaterlabs.com. Let's build something extraordinary together. Welcome back. We've been talking to Afrikah Selah about culturally minded criticism. And, Afrikah, you've been such a sort of influential critic. You have all these essays. I want to talk a little bit more about the creative side of you, the maker side of you. And so, what are you currently writing, thinking about as a maker?
Sure. as a maker, I'm thinking about what does it mean to be more civically engaged, or another side of that is what does it mean to create art that focuses on community placemaking? Because I think that with everything going on that we are witnessing and have experienced in this past year alone, like I am sensing and have also been like feeling the pulses around like us as artists, makers, doers, arriving to a space where I think the arts is going to be asked to step up in a different way and like through alternative means.
Can you be a little bit more
Mhm.
specific about that? Like, I'm gonna sort of press you on that.
Sure.
So how do you imagine sort of art taking up this community space, right? Because I think there are sort of two different ways that we can think about it, whether we talk about sort of civically minded from a political sphere, from a technological sphere, that we provide something unique that perhaps, AI's taken over the world, like
Right.
maybe that's sort of where we need to sort of hold the line. And there's obviously intersectionality between those elements, but what does that mean to you in terms of that sort of community based space?
Sure. I think a lot about how just as we come to see a theater, we come to a theater to like see a show and experience something, like I envision like some of the ways in which like theater as an event is sort of like the container for us to talk about what's going on in our neighborhoods, right? Or creating towards social change in a way that the art is actually facilitating a conversation that doesn't feel as scary as an audience member might have, but instead it's more of like an intervention to talk about the possibilities and the ways that we can engage in like mutual aid or the ways we can engage in community programs. I think really art being used as a like community builder than it being like a you've seen this thing and has fleeted away and like now there is no action to be taken. When in fact, no, there actually is. Like I've seen through my work with the National New Play Network, like plays in which like people are being asked to bring food as their ticket to donate, right? And instead like having more group and like immersive experiences instead of again like that distance between stage and audience. Or like as a dramaturg, like I love having facilitated conversations, but it's more than just like us talking with the playwright, but instead, hey, let's engage around a piece of art and actually let me bring like these community members that like can not only connect you to resources, but also give you more context and knowledge to something that you just never have interacted with before.
Absolutely. I think, of our land acknowledgements, right, that obviously many theaters sort of perform in and sort of bring to the space. But I've always sort of, right, pressed organizations that I've been a part of not to just make the land acknowledgement, but to really sort of provide resources that allow us to support our indigenous communities. I think that's really important, that if you're going to engage in the land acknowledgement, you need to go one step further. If
Mhm.
not, then you're just virtue signaling. And I think that kind of art, at least being civically minded, is providing those resources, providing those places where people can go. Um, I love those ideas. Are there specific themes that you find yourself returning to across these different sort of communities, different pieces?
Yeah, like, I'll add to my last thought that, to what you spoke to, there's also something around, like, reciprocity and relationship building, which is also what I'm thinking about, and so, like, that is a theme, especially around like social change or at least social transformation. Like, how are those two things in conversation, as well as like repair. So, not even thinking about like how we understand reparations overall, but like repair among like communities and neighbors to each other. Because it's not easy, but I think it's part of the work that we often ignore that like I just often see myself returning to.
That's so true. I think, it can be scary for theaters to engage with because it means difficult conversations in talkback spaces. It means, meeting with audiences that are perhaps of a different viewpoint, of a different thought process, or have never been exposed to such things. But I think that's where the excitement of theater comes to, right? That's where the liveness of that interaction, I think, is what I'm hearing for you. Um, so yeah, like what would you say, thematically, is it about something unique to your community that you're particularly interested in? Is it something more sort of community as a sort of, across state lines, across city lines? Like how local are you going in your exploration of that practice?
Yeah, like I think in this context, I am thinking more locally just because I know a little bit more Boston than I do like New York and Chicago. But like, I think I am interested in like this idea of, movement and, thinking a lot about fragments and the way that ecosystems work through. I'm forgetting the word, the book, but it's by Adrienne Marie Brown. It'll come back to me later, or at
We'll look
least
it up.
after.
We'll look it up later. We'll
We'll
make
look it
sure
up.
we put it in the show notes. Yeah,
Um, Thank you. But I'm really thinking about like in this the small to all model, right? Like how does Boston come together and like how does that trickle to, across state lines? And how I think we navigate spaces and use our privileges or at least use the tools that we all have to work towards like again this like common goal towards a better world or like a better infrastructure or whatever the focus may be. And to that, like I think I'm really interested in work that is decentered because so many people can work towards a common goal just like in a different way.
absolutely. I think that's, I think there are a few articles I think that I've read about sort of, right, this idea of we've always set up theater in a hierarchical model. And even, on Broadway today, that sort of persists. But what would that look like if we were to decentralize an organization, or decentralize our production processes? You know, it seems chaotic. I'm scared of it. Like talking about it makes me anxious as a director, and I'm like, but we got to get the show. There's a show date,. But I think that's the sort of urgency of production, right? Like that is we are establishing a certain timeline, and so in that, do you imagine that this practice might be your outcomes might be different and they might be slower than, let's say, your typical production timeline on projects like these?
Yeah, like I come from a practice where it was like we would create the thing once, but it's not the end of it, right? Like there could be so many iterations. So it may look like a touring model, right? Or it could be, hey, we started off with the seed of an idea and it has grown so many iterations that of course multiple plays have come out and like in those multiple plays are, different conversations or different community members engaging with this. So it sort of is like forum theater. Maybe it's different, who knows? But like I think it is very much like experimental and not tied to one thing, if that makes
That's
sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like you're describing Forge Theater Labs. Thanks. Appreciate that. Appreciate the pitch.
Yes.
Absolutely. I think all joking aside, it is kind of what we do here at Forge Theater Labs, is that we're trying to make theater that is about theater and having a forum to discuss our processes, to think about sort of how we experiment, how we innovate, but also make it an enjoyable experience at the same time while engaging our community from far and wide and also, really local. Um, and I think that idea of slowing down for us also sort of rings true, even though we have many episodes, we have many things. I think this is a great time to sort of wrap it up. What's one practice, creative or critical, you'd say you're committed to slowing down?
Ooh, I am trying to commit to the practice of slowing down for myself, um, which is, I think, something we spoke about earlier. And I say that because I think when I was a producer and program manager, it was very much like I have to be on the go so these projects can happen instead of it being I am showing up to do the work, which has a different rhythm attached to that I don't think we've talked about, but it's a conversation I've been seeing bubbling up now with where we are. And now that it's winter, it feels very much, appropriate to talk about.
Now it feels like an ever long winter at that. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think, for me, like I have to remind myself that like artists are people too. And that replies to myself. Like, there's this need to sort of move at a superhuman pace to be larger than life, when we do what we do and yet sort of sacrifice that. But like giving ourselves the time and space to sort of build that momentum, I think is really important. We've mentioned this before, and they can probably find this on our website, but where can listeners find your writing and ongoing work?
Folks can find my writing at itsafrikah.com/writing.
Amazing, amazing. Last question. Anything you want our listeners to sort of carry into their next encounter with art, and we can both go.
Ooh. I think for me, I would love the listeners to carry in their next encounter of work, like the first answer is joy. But I think like what is the visceral emotion that sparks for you when you see art?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say is be fearless with how you describe your joy with art.
Mm.
Be fearless with how you think about art because that's what keeps the art going. That's what keeps you engaged with the art. Um, we've been talking to Afrikah Selah. It's a pleasure, as always, to catch up with you. Thank you so much, Afrikah.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a joy.
See you next time on Forge Theater Labs.
This episode was hosted by Joshua N Hsu with post-production by Sam Rappaport.